about marijuana at the end as well. And what I thought I would do, given how we sort of jumped out with this whole business of regulating industrial hemp, talk a little bit about how we got there and some of the issues that we've been facing in getting a program up and running, and then some of the remaining challenges that we see, and perhaps there'll be some lessons here that I can convey to some of you whose states are either considering or just getting it started, and maybe you can learn a little bit from some of the wires that we tripped over as we've gone along the way. So hopefully this will work. It does work. Good. Excellent. Well, this all got underway in 2012 with the adoption of Amendment 64, and I'll refer to that term Amendment 64 from time to time. This was a ballot initiative that was considered in November of 2012 in Colorado, and that amendment essentially put before the voters, do you want to legalize recreational marijuana? And it was adopted. It was adopted by about 54 or 55% of the vote. Well, about 98% of this Amendment 64 dealt with recreational marijuana. It did include a directive to the state legislature to enact a program governing the cultivation, processing, and sale of industrial hemp. And this again was approved by the voters. And it just, I think everybody probably knows this, but we define industrial hemp as having 0.3% or less of tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC. And THC, of course, is the intoxicating effect that you see in cannabis. Usually with marijuana, the percentage is something between 10 and 15% of THC, sometimes even higher. But industrial hemp, at least in Colorado, and I think in most of the country where this has been addressed, is 0.3%. So it's a very, very small amount of THC. Well, the Colorado State Legislature took that directive, and they created a registration and inspection program for both research and development, but also commercial cultivation. They also created an industrial hemp advisory committee, which was very helpful to us. And then they turned around and delegated the regulatory authority to the Colorado Department of Agriculture. Now, Colorado had already implemented a medical marijuana program going back to 2010, actually a little bit earlier. That regulatory authority went to a different agency in Colorado, in this case, the Department of Revenue. What they did is they broke out industrial hemp because they were treating it as this is going to be an agricultural commodity. So jurisdiction would properly reside within CEA. So we had to go through a rulemaking process of how to make this thing work. It was a novel experience for us and something new, and we had to figure out what we needed to do, especially given the fact that we were dealing in an environment where this was still illegal under federal law, and we really hadn't had much guidance at this point as how the federal government would react to what we were doing. Being that it was a new experience, one of the places that we looked to was to Canada as to how they'd set up their program that had been going on for a few years. I mentioned the Industrial Hemp Advisory Committee. This was something that was appointed by the legislature, by both the House and Senate Ag Committee chairs. And this turned out to be very important because it brought together a number of stakeholders who were interested in industrial hemp, both in the agricultural community and the hemp activist community, law enforcement, and a number of folks. And this was helpful because as we were hammering out our regulations, we were getting buy-in from all of these groups. And so when we actually went to the implementation, it really was very helpful. We have the rulemaking process, and our final rule was published effective December the 30th of 2013. Some of the issues that we had to address when we were developing this was the registration and inspection part of it. What kinds of information would we ask of the registrants? what would the cost be? And how would we test for the THC? That was one of the mandates we had, is that we had to inspect and test to make sure that the THC cap was not being exceeded. So we had to deal with issues related to sampling, seed availability, what would happen if we found non-compliant plants during our testing process, and then finally deal with law enforcement concerns, of which there were several. With registration and inspection, one of the things we had to deal with was cost. We were giving just a little bit of startup money to pay for the rulemaking process. But this is going to be a program, it is a program that fees have to cover the cost. It's a cash-funded program. So we had to make some guesses as to what we would charge in order to help cover our cost. And I'll come back to that in just a moment. Lab facilities. Well, there are a few private labs in Colorado that have sprung up since the medical marijuana process started. But their focus is on medical marijuana testing and now recreational marijuana testing. And while they could certainly test for THC, we did have some concerns about how long it would take, because the real money was going to be in marijuana, not in industrial hemp. And so we have a biochemistry lab within the Colorado Department of Agriculture, and we have set them up now. They've gone through their certification process where they can test for the THC content. And the grower is going to pay for the cost of that testing. So who would be sampled? What would be sampled, and when would the sampling take place, and so forth? While there were some suggestions that we inspect and test 100% of all growers, it really became a resource question, and our ability to do that with the existing resources that we had. And remember, we weren't given any more money to do this, so we had to deal with that. And we ultimately selected up to 33% of all registrants would be sampled. So that, I'll come back to that again in just a moment, but we had to deal with sampling questions. Seed availability. I have a lot more to say about this in just a moment, but we wanted to have some sense of what variety of seed people were using. A lot of folks really weren't sure what kind of seed they would have. And we also did not ask, where did you get your seed? We decided that that was not something we needed to know, and we did not want our registrants to be putting down on paper where they got their industrial hemp seed. If you have it, that's all we needed to know as our registration process. What about non-compliant plants? What were we going to do with those? We had every expectation that, especially here early in the first year or two and maybe beyond, that some plants that are sampled are going to exceed 0.3%. It's just going to happen for a variety of reasons. You know, obviously there are concerns from some of the growers that, geez, what happens if I put a lot of money into this, I sink a lot of money into the ground, and you know, then I come in with non-compliant plants. I can't get crop insurance or any other sort of risk management tool. Well, there's not a whole lot we can do with this, because the Constitution said 0.3% or less is industrial hemp. Anything over that is marijuana, even if it's 0.4 or 0.5. So we really didn't have much in the way of leeway dealing with that. But we figured that between 0.3% and 1%, you know, we're not going to revoke the registration, and we're not going to suspend the grower for the coming year, as long as they dispose of the offending hemp in a manner that was approved by the commissioner. Unfortunately, there aren't very many ways to do that. We're going to deal with it on a case-by-case basis. It has to remain on site. You cannot take it off-site. You cannot, you know, sell it in any way, because that would be a violation of Colorado state law, both statutory and by amendment. So that's still going to be a little bit of a touchy issue of how we deal with those offending plants. I think for the most part, they're likely to be destroyed. But there may be some instances where it can be used on-site on the farm in some way that we'll find to be approvable. So our rule basically did this. We started a registration program on March the 1st with an ending date of May the 1st. So we had a 2-month registration period. That ending date, by the way, has now been eliminated by the legislature that just concluded. They figured that if you're doing indoor R&D in a greenhouse, why limit the registration to just a 2-month period? So we're going to have year-round registration now. And the only thing we ask or require is that you apply with us 30 days prior to planting. You need a report at the beginning saying that you're using seed that meets the limits. Our inspection program, as I mentioned, up to 33% of registrants will have their plants sampled in testing. And if we find issues, we do have the ability to test more than that, but we're going to select 33% and go with that. The fees that we came up with for R&D, the registration fee is $100 plus $5 an acre. And for commercial production, it's $200 plus $1 an acre. And then we have some enforcement provisions with regard to being able to fine people, suspend registrations, or whatever we might need to do in the event that there is a violation of the law. Just a quick word about the fees. They, quite frankly, are not covering our costs. And as we go through the coming year, we're going to have to sit down and kind of reconfigure those and figure out what those fees need to be. But the $100 plus $5 an acre and $200 plus $1 an acre are not covering our fees, or our cost within the department. Now, law enforcement throughout this process in Colorado had a number of concerns, and I'll just focus on the Colorado Attorney General's office and law enforcement officials. There were certainly some concerns expressed at the national level as well. And one of those was that hemp fields would be used to hide illicit marijuana. Another one was that we really need to inspect all growers, 100% of growers, and that those inspections should be unannounced, and that if there was an issue, law enforcement could go with our inspectors, and then the collection of information about registrants that would be available to law enforcement. As I mentioned about the 100% inspection, as a resource matter, we just couldn't do that, and we just didn't think it was necessary. With other programs that we have, like inspecting potatoes in southern Colorado, we select a percentage and we'll do those inspections and things and so forth. There's been a lot of discussion about using hemp fields to hide marijuana, and I am not an expert on this by any means, but apparently growing marijuana in the hemp field actually causes the THC levels in marijuana to eventually go down through the cross-pollination. That didn't really seem to be too big of an issue. I think they more or less backed off on that one. Now, let me just say this about unannounced inspections. We need to know when you as the grower, when your plants are going to flower, because that is when the highest level of THC is likely to be present. And so we need to work with the growers that we're going to sample. And when you expect to have flowering and when you expect to harvest, and then we can work out an inspection schedule. Well, one of the reasons law enforcement wanted unannounced inspections was for obvious reasons. They just want us to pop in and surprise people. Our inspectors are not law enforcement officials. They're inspectors, and we're not asking them to go in and to enforce the marijuana laws or to be law enforcement officials. And if law enforcement was really concerned that we were going to find a lot of illicit marijuana, well, the last thing that I wanted was to send my inspectors into what could have been a very dangerous or harmful situation. I'm not even sure that that's really going to exist, but we did not, and we would not go for the unannounced inspections. So just something to keep in mind. To really do this properly, you really need to work with the grower so that you can test for the THC at the appropriate time. Well, while all of this was going on, of course, we had to deal with the federal response to all of this. Shortly after Amendment 64 was adopted, both Governor John Hickenlooper and our State Attorney General John Suthers wrote a letter to Attorney General Eric Holder saying, "Okay, now what? What happens next? And are you going to seek to block or to intervene to stop us from carrying out Amendment 64? Are you going to have enforcement and actions against growers, cultivators, as well as those in possession or users? Well, we got a letter back in August of last year, and some of you may be familiar with the Cole Memorandum from the Department of Justice. This basically said, you know, marijuana or cannabis is still illegal. We still have you know, major concerns about enforcement. However, we're going to defer enforcement actions as long as 8 federal enforcement priorities were not implicated. And those 8 enforcement priorities included things like keeping the cannabis within the state, not having it diverted out of state, keeping it out of the hands of kids, making sure that any proceeds from any of these processes were not diverted into criminal enterprises, and some things like that. So that was more or less the go-ahead. In December of last year, we wrote to Secretary Vilsack concerning what impact industrial hemp cultivation on a farm might have on USDA program eligibility. And for example, if you had 1,000 acres and you grew industrial hemp on 50 acres and wheat or corn on 950 acres, you know, was that going to have, you know, that hemp, was that going to in some way mess with your eligibility for farm bill programs or anything else? Well, let's just say we've had some verbal conversations and with the department and with the secretary, and you know, there is going to be no impact on farm bill eligibility. And in fact, in April, the department put out, I believe through FSA, a guidance on how you would count hemp acres as part of your base acreage overall. So there was going to be some accounting for that so that you didn't lose any of those acres that you might plant in industrial hemp. Well, there was one other federal response too. I guess it was in February, both the Department of Justice and the Department of the Treasury put out some guidance on banking, saying, and the guidance basically said, you know, this is illegal and you could get into a lot of trouble if you do any transactions with any of the cannabis industry, and you know, this is really bad stuff. However, if you do, you know, just utilize due diligence. Check and make sure that whoever you're conducting financial transactions with hasn't done anything bad, that they haven't violated any of these 8 federal enforcement priorities. Well, not surprisingly, the banking community, I think throughout the country, but I know particularly in Colorado, did not react to this very well, and in fact said, you know, this does not give us the kind of clear guidance and assurances that we need to conduct financial transactions with the cannabis industry. So we're not going to. So, but it was a good try, and ultimately this is going to have to be dealt with, I think, by legislation on addressing what really is money laundering and what is aiding and abetting drug trafficking, to somehow carve out a piece, not only from the marijuana side of the industry, but also on the hemp side as well. A lot of you probably are very familiar with the Farm Bill provision that was enacted earlier this year, which basically said that in those states that have legalized hemp production, hemp cultivation, that, you know, the state departments of agriculture and or institutions of higher education could conduct R&D. And there's been, you know, some interesting things going on with this. Is that, what did that really mean? Who could do it? How do you have to do it? Because we've come into a little bit of a collision with DEA on all of this, who argued for a very, very, very narrow construction of what the Farm Bill provision did. I don't want to speak for Kentucky, but Kentucky is another state that has moved forward fairly quickly with industrial hemp legalization and cultivation. And I know that they had taken the stance that this allowed them to import seed and to distribute it to private growers if they wanted to. DEA, not surprisingly, had a different response to that and said, no, it says you can cultivate for R&D purposes. Didn't say anything about, you know, being able to import seeds from Canada or Switzerland or wherever, That's still within our purview, the DEA's purview, and that's just the way it is. You got to come to us and get an import permit, and then we'll see. And on the other part of that argument, no, you cannot distribute to private growers. It says very clearly, either the State Department of Ag or institutions of higher education. Well, I mean, this has been a little messy, and what we have done is that we met with DEA, and we got a registration to import controlled substances in Colorado. The agreement we have, the deal we have, is that now that we have the registration, once we identify some industrial hemp seeds, we can then apply for an import permit, and we've been assured that we'll get that import permit. We get the seeds, we store them on our facility, and we can distribute them to the two universities that we've been talking to at this point, which is Colorado State University or the University of Colorado. That's kind of where we are right now. We're still working with the universities. Not surprisingly, both Colorado State and the University of Colorado benefit greatly from federal research dollars, federal grants. And they're moving very, very slowly to make sure that they do not risk those grants or that money in any way. But at some point here, we'll have identified some seed varieties, and we will get an import permit. I know we might be buying some from Manitoba, who knows, but we'll look for some varieties and bring those into the state. And at this point, it would not be our intent to distribute to private growers. Again, that's still an open question, but our agreement with DEA is that at this point we would just work with our universities. As I mentioned, DEA has not been real thrilled with this process. When the discussions were taking place about including something in the Farm Bill, one of the congressmen who was pushing this is from Colorado, Congressman Jared Polis, and DEA had walked around with some talking points, basically opposing even R&D efforts in hemp. It was evil stuff, it was bad, it was wrong, and so forth. I mentioned the availability of hemp seeds and getting them imported. And some of you may have read about seed shipments that have been seized. We've had 2 shipments coming into Colorado that were purchased by private growers, commercial growers, and both shipments were seized. One was seized, I think, at the North Dakota border, and another one was seized in San Diego. Kentucky had some shipments seized, which led to a court case there. And that's still somewhat ongoing, although Kentucky was allowed to go ahead and register and get an import permit, so they were able to get some of those seeds released. As I mentioned, we do have a registration now with DEA, and we do plan to import some seeds. And I think, based on some conversations in the last week or so, we're getting pretty close to identifying some seeds and bringing those into Colorado. You know, that's how we got to where we are now. Our first registration process, we had about 1,500 acres registered. I would tell you the vast majority of those acres were very small plots, I mean an acre or less. There were only 4 or 5 registrations where you would call it agricultural production size, like 130 acres or something like that. Most of it was very small. And it was fairly evenly split between R&D and commercial applications. But seed availability is still an issue, and I think a number of our growers are ultimately going to abandon their registration this year because they do not have the seed. There is some seed out there. I keep hearing rumors of seed here and seed there that's somehow found its way into Colorado. Again, we don't ask questions. And there's also probably going to be some rogue seed that when they grow it, it's going to produce God knows what, but we'll see what comes up. Processing facilities. Now this is an important part of this because part of the promise with industrial hemp is that if you're allowed to grow it, there will be processing money coming in, investment money coming into the state of Colorado to build processing facilities. Don't know that that's really happened yet, but you kind of see the dilemma here. is that the folks aren't yet willing to invest a lot of money into a processing infrastructure until there is enough hemp cultivated to make it worthwhile. And it's probably not going to be enough hemp cultivated until there are more processing facilities, because another provision of the law in Colorado is that you have to process your raw hemp in-state. You cannot send your unprocessed raw hemp to Indiana or to Ohio or to wherever. It's got to be processed in Colorado. Now, I don't know yet that we've really fully dealt with what does processing mean. You know, what's the minimal amount of processing that has to take place. I mentioned financial institutions, still very much an issue. Pesticides. In both the marijuana and hemp industries, there is a need and an interest in pesticides and fungicides, which are, of course, regulated by EPA. And there is no EPA-approved pesticide or fungicide for marijuana, for cannabis. We're under an executive order from the governor to develop a list of banned substances. The implication being is that there's going to be a list of approved substances. We're having to work with EPA on that, working within the state. Up to this point, EPA has balked a little bit and say, but you know what you're doing is illegal under federal law, under EPA laws. And we said everything we're doing here is illegal under federal law. You know, give us a break. USDA is working with us. The Attorney General is working with us. You know, the Treasury Department, FDA. So that has not come to a conclusion yet, and we're not quite sure how to deal with that, because you've got these labels that say you can use this pesticide or this fungicide for these purposes, again, none of which are for cannabis. We have to be careful that we don't put something out there that says, yeah, this is okay, and then that stuff gets used for edibles and it's consumed by consumers. And you know, nobody's really done the testing with regard to toxicity and tolerances and things like that, and potential impacts on human health with the ingesting of some of these products using some of these pesticides. So that's an issue. Medical research. Probably most of you have heard of Charlotte's Web. Charlotte's Web is this medicinal marijuana, I'll call it, that has been being used on kids with seizures. And we have a lot of families bringing their kids into Colorado to access this particular treatment. And what it is, it's low in THC, very, very low in THC, but high in cannabidiols, or CBD, is the substance in the plant. So the fact that it's low in THC, there's an inverse relationship. Low in THC means you probably have high CBD levels. And what some folks are doing is taking those high CBD plants, turning them into oils, and then they're using those oils to treat these kids with seizures. To this point, most of the growth and research had been done through the medical marijuana program, but that's a very strict program, very rigorously regulated, much more so than the hemp program is. And so now they're coming over and registering in the industrial hemp program. And we have no reason to deny them a registration. All they have to do is fill out the form, pay the money, and they're good to go. But that's an issue, and it'll be an ongoing issue, I think, in a number of states I've been reading, where some of the medical marijuana, and particularly the high CBD stuff, is being looked at either in allowing it or providing for research. Open records, just a question. Our records are, I think, like for most of you, are open to public scrutiny. And we had to make some decisions about what we could exclude from disclosure. In our case, we figured there was some information that fell under the private and trade secrets and a few things like that, privileged information, such as the size of your acreage, the variety of seed, and your GPS coordinates. We felt that those should not be released to the public. So far, we haven't been challenged, and if we do at some point, then I guess we'll find out if those were correct assertions. And I just mentioned uncertainty because, look, we're still in the first year of this program. We are still learning some stuff both on the regulatory side and the cultivation side, and figuring some things out. And we're doing this because not only are we doing R&D, but commercial as well. And we were doing, the Farm Bill provision didn't have to exist. We had our program and we were going forward with it anyway, including the commercial side of it. And we're still doing that, but it's still early. And I've been telling my folks back in Colorado, give it 3 to 5 years. I think it's going to evolve and develop over time as we learn things, as maybe we begin to figure out some solutions with the conflict between federal and state laws. But this is the first year. Let's get through this first year and learn some lessons and go from there. So finally, let me say a word or two about marijuana as well. Of course, we were not the only state to legalize marijuana. Washington State did as well, which made for a lot of fun back in February at the Super Bowl. And there were those, given the results of the Super Bowl, who indicated that it was clear Colorado had a jump on the recreational marijuana use. For those of you who remember the Super Bowl outcome, it was not pretty for Denver. So. But we had a lot of fun with this. And we don't have the regulatory authority for marijuana, but I can tell you a couple of things. One is that it's too early to draw conclusions. And I've been reading stories over the last 2 or 3 months where everybody is already stating, this is a great success, or this is a catastrophe, disaster. And in reality, we're only 6 months into this. What we do know is that some revenue is coming in. We have, for marijuana, for recreational marijuana, we have a state sales tax of 2.9%. And that's actually a state sales tax for anything you sell in Colorado, 2.9%. We also have a marijuana-specific state sales tax of 10%. On top of that, we have a marijuana state excise tax of 15%. And then you've got your local sales taxes as well in those communities that have opted in. Now, local communities can opt out. And in a large part of the state, you cannot find a marijuana dispensary because those communities have opted out. Colorado Springs, for example, is one of those. But Denver, where most of the dispensaries are located, opted in. And it looks like that the tax collections, the revenue collections, are a little below right now where we thought they would be. We've collected about $35 million through the first 6 months from all marijuana taxes, fees, and licenses. So not just the taxes, but fees and licenses as well. Now, that's from all. That includes medical marijuana. And the estimate is that out of that $35 million, about $19 million in taxes have come in from the recreational side. And there were some estimates that figured that would be a little higher. And some of the early analysis is that the medical marijuana side, that the taxes is much lower. It's basically the 2.9% sales tax. And the thought was that once recreational marijuana became legal, a number of those folks from the medical marijuana side would come over because it would be easier to deal with. And there have been some questions as to how genuine were all these medical marijuana patients. And I don't want to question that, but at least there was some thought that there'd be some folks who, rather than go through the hassle of dealing with a physician and getting certified, would just go to the recreational side. And apparently that's not happening. The medical marijuana side is still doing very, very, very well. And while there's been some growth in the recreational side, it's still basically 2/3 medical marijuana and 1/3 recreational. So some of the issues that have been brought out of marijuana have been, particularly with regard to edibles. That has been, I think, the one thing that maybe people didn't really see coming, and that is, you can buy an edible, and what I'm learning is, and what I'm hearing is that 10 milligrams in an edible, 10 milligrams of THC is about a pleasant place to be, so I'm told. And I don't know, maybe some. So 10 milligrams, and what was happening is that there were edibles being sold, like candy bars and cookies and the like, that contained up to 100 milligrams. And 100 milligram is the cap. And that there were people who were buying these high milligram dosages and getting a cookie and like eating the whole thing and having a not unpredictable reaction to that. And I think there was a New York Times columnist, Maureen Dowd, some of you may have read her experience. She came to Denver a few weeks ago and bought an edible and thought she would, for the column's sake, see what happens. And she, as she fully admitted, did not quite know what she was doing. And she, I think, took a little portion of a candy bar and ate it, waited a few minutes, nothing happened. Okay, well, I'll eat a little bit more. Nothing happened, and so she ate a little bit more. And then by the time she accumulated, I think, far more than 10 milligrams, it hit her. And you'll have to find her comments about how she became real paranoid, and somebody knocked on the door. She thought she was going to be dragged out and arrested, and then she curled up in bed, and I don't know. So that's been an issue, because we have had a couple of deaths that seem to be potentially related to individuals getting a hold of these high dosage edibles and consuming the whole thing. One individual back in the late winter, early spring, jumped off a balcony, and I think it was another death as well. And so there's a process going on right now, the regulatory process, to try to deal with this and try to limit any given edible simply to 10 milligrams. And if you want higher dosing, and there are some individuals who argue that they can do high dosing, you're just going to have to buy more of it and deal with it that way. But that a single serving cannot exceed 10 milligrams of THC. So that we ought to have some regulations out later this month on dealing with that, and see what happens. One other thing, this has been very entertaining throughout this process. I mentioned the Amendment 64. One of the things that the governor did shortly after the amendment passed was create an Amendment 64 implementation task force. And it was 24 of us, and the purpose of it was to take a first look at what a regulatory structure ought to look like. It included members of the state legislature, it included marijuana activists, it included a DU law professor, it included some business interests, some labor interests, and law enforcement interests. So it was a kind of a broad collection within these 24 individuals to sit down and say, well, what might a retail recreational marijuana regulatory structure look like? And so we addressed a lot of issues from labeling and packaging and how to keep it out of the hands of kids. And one issue that came up was, should non-residents be allowed to come into Colorado and purchase recreational marijuana? Now, the state constitution was clear. If you were in Colorado and you had it in your possession, you were good. That was good. But then could you bring in your Kansas driver's license or your Nebraska driver's license and buy recreational marijuana? And initially the reaction was, well, no, that might violate, border issues or something like that. And then we woke up and said, part of this is about revenue, and dollars from Nebraska and Kansas are just as good as dollars from Colorado. So we would welcome that revenue. Well, then the issue became, well, should they be allowed to buy a full ounce? Because in Colorado, you can possess and purchase up to 1 ounce. And the thought was, well, people might come in and amass large quantities and then take it back to Kansas or Nebraska or Wyoming or wherever and then mark it up and sell it. And somebody said, well, maybe we should limit it to maybe an 1/8 of an ounce or 1/4 of an ounce. Make it a little more difficult. But if you're from Nebraska, you could come in and buy 1/4 of an ounce. Now, these were public meetings. We sat around a table like this in a large room, and the rooms were always packed, just packed with citizens and marijuana activists and others wanting to kind of see what we were thinking about. So we're having this discussion, and one of the task force members says, well, how many joints can you roll with 1/4 of an ounce? And of course, all these hands in the audience, they started shooting up like this. And a couple of seconds passed, and then another member of the task force said, well, I think it depends on the size of the doobie. And I have to tell you, at that moment, I thought about all the years I've been in public service. I never thought I'd be sitting around a table in a public forum talking about the size of the doobie. But there you have it. That's been the story in Colorado over the last year, both with industrial hemp and with marijuana. Again, I think in both cases, we're still pursuing this great experiment, as our governor has referred to it. Economic impacts, I think there will be some. I think certainly we're going to see it more quickly with marijuana because of the tax revenue, because of the sales that are generated, because it's fully up and running right now. It's fully functioning. The industrial hemp side, I think, is going to take a little bit longer. There's a lot of hope and promise that we'll see processing facilities develop in rural areas. We've had some indication that could be the case, and that would be good. It would hopefully generate a little bit of economic activity there. So with that, I think I have utilized all my time, and I don't know if there's any questions or anything, or Carolyn, what the procedure is.
We have time for 2 or 3 questions, and I'd like to start it off with kind of a two-parter. In Indiana, we recently passed a bill dealing with industrial hemp, and part of the real persuasive argument for this was the medicinal effect that these young children could receive from the oil. And I asked the question in the committee, and I've asked it other places, but why aren't the big pharmaceutical companies tugging on my jacket, telling me that we should be working on this? Where are the Eli Lillys, the Dows, the Mercks, the big pharmaceutical bears, the big pharmaceutical companies? Why are they not doing that? And then secondly, all of us in our various states have a tobacco use and cessation program, and we've had funds available to promote tobacco cessation. And I'd just like to know the relationship and response from those folks to this whole marijuana question that's going on in Colorado, if you can address that.
Well, the first part on you mentioned tobacco cessation, and I think with marijuana, there's also been some concerns and interest with regard to education and not preventing people from using it, but making sure that all the issues are laid out, and particularly toward children. That this is, although it's legal and adults can use it, it's not a good thing. We don't want to encourage children. So some of the tax money that is being collected is going to go into some of those education and cessation efforts to try to hopefully deal with public awareness that there could be some issues, that you need to go into this understanding that marijuana does have some impacts. In some cases, maybe we don't fully understand what those impacts are. So you do have that, and we are utilizing it and using some resources, both for education and cessation, as well as just for research, medical research as well. Now, on the first question, I don't really have the answer to that. I do know, I think with a couple of conversations that I had, a couple of folks, I think there's still a little bit of uncertainty about where all this is headed, particularly given the fact that cannabis is still a Schedule I drug under the Controlled Substances Act. And so I think there may be a little bit of hesitancy there, but I've also been told that it's coming, that sooner or later, this is something that is going to draw a broader interest, and especially once we get to a point, for example, FDA, I think, has already approved some clinical trials using CBDs and industrial hemp. And I think there's some other studies going on as well. And those had not been happening prior to this point. So, will that maybe remove some of the hesitancy that maybe that's there at some point? I got to believe that if industrial hemp, particularly medical hemp, low THC, high CBD takes off, and more states adopt it and pass it, there's going to be money to be made there, right? I think, and I would think that might provide a little more incentive and a little more encouragement to move forward.
Darren, and speaking to the microphone.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that presentation. And my questions is, what caused Colorado to want to do this? Why do you want to challenge the federal government? Is it from the money issue, period, or was it from the users of marijuana that really put the pressure on Colorado to do something like that?
You've never been to Boulder?
The only thing I can remember is a few years ago that we had to be careful about bringing Coors beer back to Michigan. So,
no, very, very good question. And I started by saying that in Colorado, to get a ballot initiative onto the ballot, it's actually fairly easy to do. And it's one of the things that a number of us in agriculture talk about occasionally, because there are some things that get proposed in agriculture that we're not real happy about. And for example, dictating what animal husbandry practices are to the agricultural industry. And so far we've been able to beat those back, but it's easy for the most part to get an initiative on the ballot. The marijuana proponents were able successfully to file a title and get the signatures necessary to put it on the November 2012 ballot. And it passed. The voters of Colorado, I mean, for however you want to characterize it, 55%, 54 or 55% said, yeah, we'll do this. And so we, the governor had no choice but to carry out the will of the voters. Governor Hickenlooper had actually expressed some opposition to it prior to the vote, and afterwards came out and said, we're gonna fulfill the will of the voters, and we're gonna do everything we can to make sure that the voters' wishes, as expressed in the ballot, are carried out. This was back in November of 2012. He said, however, it's still against federal law. We don't know what their reaction is going to be, so you better not break out the Cheetos and goldfish just yet. Now, some of you get that. I heard that. So, but things have played out the way that they've played out. So, and there was a poll taken last month, I believe, in Colorado. Do you still support legalization of marijuana? And has the experience of the previous few months changed your mind? And it was still 54% said they still supported legalization. So, yeah, I mean, it's basically the will of voters.
Just wanted to make a few comments. It's been legal in Canada since 1998, and Manitoba produces about 12 to 15,000 acres a year of industrial hemp. God knows how much marijuana. We have 4 processors in the province now making oil, selling seed in health food stores, which is all organic. And most recently, we have attracted a company, Chinese-based, for the fiber content. The exports so far have been all back to China for the processing area. It has commercial value. There are some growing pains, both with the regulatory and with the harvest. My recommendation to anyone taking the combine to the field the first time to harvest their hemp is take a fire extinguisher. Almost every combine burns at least once.
It's very, very tough stuff to...
Very tough stuff, and it builds on the barriers and
Sure.
on the fire.
How many acres did you say?
12,000 is about the average.
Okay. And I mean, you mentioned that, and we talk about what's the potential economic impact, and I don't know what the total acreage is in Canada, but I think as of about 2011, worldwide, there were about 200,000 acres planted in industrial hemp. Worldwide, 200,000 acres. I think I got that from a congressional research study. And the first reaction to that is, wow, 200,000 acres, that's a lot. And then you think, well, 200,000 acres really isn't that much in the grand scheme of things. So, what does that tell you about the market? And I don't know that it tells you a lot yet, but, economically, I think the rise or fall of industrial hemp is going to be not unlike the rise or fall of any other agricultural commodity. And I refer to it as an ag commodity at this point. I'm a farmer. we get to a point, what kind of price is it going to fetch me? Okay? If it, our farmers in Colorado, and I'm sure in the rest of the country, doing this, to be profitable, raising corn, wheat, or whatever. And if they don't see a profit in industrial, then they won't grow it. They need something to entice them away from corn or wheat or soybeans if they're going to go into industrial hemp. On the flip side of this, there have been estimates that industrial hemp can be used for roughly 25,000 different products across about 9 different categories, from food and pharmaceuticals and construction materials and soaps and lotions and fiber, and just a lot of things. Okay, take away for a moment a hemp-specific product, a product that is a hemp shirt or a hemp soap or a hemp lotion, but it's just a product where that hemp can be used for it. You're a processor, and you're only going to use hemp if that hemp is competitive price-wise to the other inputs. And if it's not, then, if hemp costs you $30 a unit, however a unit might be defined, and another input's going to cost you $27, again, economically, you're going to go with what makes the most sense. And so I think we have a lot yet to learn as to how that's going to play out. But we get right down to it, I think the market's ultimately going to determine just how successful this is economically. And I think we're a ways yet from getting there, just because we're still fighting this battle between the states and the federal government. So we don't have uniformity. There's still all this uncertainty. And I know I've had a lot of producers in Colorado sit out this first year. They're interested, but they don't want to be the guinea pigs.
Last question or comment, Jim from Manitoba.
One of the arguments that people have used for making it legal, of course, other than taxing it, is that they would keep the criminals out. And I don't know that that has worked that well. And I think in Canada, a lot of the criminals actually applied to grow the stuff. And also street gangs and so on find out where people are growing it, and then they raid the place and attack it. So I'm just wondering what kind of experience has happened so far in the States regarding the idea that we're going to get the criminals out of the business if we legalize it.
And that was one of the arguments I think made in Colorado too, was that you would have legitimate enterprises being taxed and with a regulatory structure, and so they'd be operating like most other businesses, maybe with a stricter system, and then we would be sending fewer and fewer dollars to Mexico and Colombia, to drug cartels. So again, it's too new in Colorado. There have been a couple of studies that said that so far in the first half of the year, crime's gone down. Well, there's a cause and effect issue there. It could have gone down for a lot of reasons, having nothing to do with the marijuana business or issues related to marijuana. So that's certainly one of the arguments that was made, and I guess we'll see what happens over time. I want to go back just a moment to the question about harvesting real fast. I was doing an interview on CNBC about 2 months ago,